useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son, too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull, gray Tuesday our story starts, there was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large, tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls.
Let's get a dab done first, everyone.
Chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar: a cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What was he thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove toward town, he thought of nothing except a large order of grills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, grills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes, the get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him. But then it struck Mr. Dursley
There's nothing on
that
this
was
one.
probably some silly stuff. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived in the Brumming parking lot, his mind back on grills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the ninth floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on grills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl, even at nighttime. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the bakers. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. Whispering excitedly too. He couldn't see a single connecting tin. He was on his way back past them, catching a large donut in the bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters, that's right, that's what I heard. Yes, their son Harry. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried to the office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking. No, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual man. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her. Couldn't blame her. They had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon. And when he reached the building at 5 o'clock, he was so busy that he walked straight in outside the door. He grunted as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost on the contrary, his face had a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even Nuggles like you to be celebrating this happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was now sitting on his bed. He was sure it was the same. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Sure," said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter, and how Dudley had learned a new word, won't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, brood watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newscaster allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious. And now, over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? "Well, Ted," said the weatherman, "I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of the rain I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight." Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in town today. So, snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casually as he could, their son, he'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty, common name if you ask me. Oh, yes, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom,
Put my
Mr. Dursley crept to
gloves off of my hands.
and peered down into the front garden. The cat
No.
was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it were waiting for something.
Those copper tone gloves.
Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if he got out that they were related to a pair of... Well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well what he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia
make sure I don't
could get mixed
spill
up
it.
in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when the car door slammed on the next street, nor when 2 owls swooped overhead.
Hey Chris, how you doing?
It was nearly midnight.
Just
before
doing a
the cat
little
moved at
diamond painting.
all. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently, you'd have thought he just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched, and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen on Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept the ground, and high-heeled, buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long.
I don't have my translator on me right now, Chris, but definitely appreciate you stopping by, brother.
His name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something. But he did seem to realize he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He found what he was looking for in his inside pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little puff. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered.
It's a pretty cool one. It's like a little
12 times
Mushroom Valley type deal.
until the only lights left on the whole
I don't know if
street
that helps y'all
were two
see it or
tiny
not,
pinpricks in the distance,
but
which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their window now,
I take it all this
Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see
this
anything
off
that
you
was
so you can
happening
see it
down
better
below.
here in a second.
Dumbledore slipped the cadaver back inside his cloak and set off down the street toward number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses exactly the shape of the markings the cat had had around its eyes. She, too, was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black
I had
hair
to
was
put
drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day? When you could have been celebrating. I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh yes, everyone's celebrating all right," she said impatiently. "You'd think they'd be a bit more careful, but no. Even the Muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on their news." She jerked her head back at the Dursleys' dark living room window. "I heard it. Flocks of owls, shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent. I'll bet that was Dedalus Diggle. He never had much sense." "You can't blame them," said Dumbledore gently. "We've had precious little to celebrate for 11 years. "I know that," said Professor McGonagall irritably, "but that's no reason to lose our heads. People are being downright careless, out on the streets in broad daylight, not even dressed in Muggle clothes, swapping rumors." She threw a sharp sideways glance at Dumbledore here, as though hoping he was going to tell her something. But he didn't, so she went on. "A fine thing it would be if on the very day you-know-who seems to have disappeared at last, the Muggles found out about us all." "I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore?" "It certainly seems so," said Dumbledore. "We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a lemon drop?" "A what?" "A lemon drop. They're a kind of Muggle sweet I'm rather fond of." "No, thank you," said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think this was the moment for lemon drops. "As I say, even if you-know-who has gone, my dear Professor, surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you-know-who nonsense. For 11 years I have been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name, Voldemort." Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unsticking 2 lemon drops, seemed not to notice. "It all gets so confusing if we keep saying you-know-who. I have never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name." "I know you haven't," said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperated, half admiring. "But you're different. Everyone knows you're the only one you know." "Oh, all right. Voldemort was frightened of." "You flatter me," said Dumbledore calmly. "Voldemort has powers I will never have. Only because you're too, well, noble to use them. It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new earmuffs." Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, "The owls are nothing next to the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying about why he's disappeared, about what finally stopped him?" It seemed that Professor McGonagall had reached the point she was most anxious to discuss, the real reason she had been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day. For neither as a cat nor as a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with such a piercing stare as she did now. It was plain that whatever everyone was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another lemon drop and did not answer. "What they're saying," she pressed on, is that last night Voldemort turned up in Godric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumor is that Lily and James Potter that they're dead. Dumbledore bowed his head. Professor McGonagall gasped. Lily and James. I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, Albus. Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled as she went on. That's not all. They're saying he tried to kill the Potter's son, Harry, but he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. No one knows why or how, but they're saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power somehow broke, and that's why he's gone. Dumbledore nodded glumly.
I know I probably do mine a little different than most people, but
after all he's done,
it works for
all
me.
the people he's killed, he couldn't kill a little boy? It's just astounding. Of all the things to stop him. But how in the name of heaven did Harry survive? We can only guess, said Dumbledore. We may never know. Professor McGonagall pulled out a lace handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore gave a great sniff as he took a golden watch from his pocket and examined it. It was a very odd watch. It had 12 hands, but no numbers. Instead, little planets were moving around the edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back in his pocket and said, Hagrid's late. I suppose it was he who told you I'd be here, by the way. Yes, said Professor McGonagall. And I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here, of all places. I've come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They're the only family he has left now. You can't mean the people who live here, cried Professor McGonagall, jumping to her feet and pointing at number 4. Dumbledore, you can't. I've been watching them all day. You couldn't find 2 people who are less like us. And they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter, come and live here. It's the best place for him, said Dumbledore firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he's older. I've written them a letter. A letter? Repeated Professor McGonagall faintly, sitting back down on the wall. Really, Dumbledore? You think you can explain all of this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about Harry. Every child in our world will know his name. Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking very seriously over the top of his half-moon glasses. It would be enough to turn any boy's head. Famous before he can walk and talk. Famous for something he won't even remember. Can't you see how much better off he'll be, growing up away from all that until he's ready to take it? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth, changed her mind, swallowed, and then said, Yes, you're right, of course. But how is the boy getting here, Dumbledore? She eyed his cloak suddenly, as though she thought he might be hiding Harry underneath it. Hagrid's bringing him. You think it wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not saying his heart isn't in the right place, said Professor McGonagall grudgingly. But you can't pretend he's not careless. He does tend to... What was that? A low rumbling sound had broken the silence around them. It grew steadily louder as they looked up and down the street for some sign of a headlight. It swelled to a roar as they both looked up at the sky, and a huge motorcycle fell out of the air and landed on the road in front of them. If the motorcycle was huge, it was nothing to the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as a normal man, and at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wild. Long tangles of bushy black hair and beard hid most of his face. He had hands the size of trash can lids, and his feet in their leather boots were like baby dolphins. In his vast muscular arms, he was holding a bundle of blankets. Hagrid, said Dumbledore, sounding relieved. At last. And where did you get that motorcycle? Borrowed it, Professor Dumbledore, sir, said the giant, climbing carefully off the motorcycle as he spoke. Young Sirius Black lent it to me. I've got him, sir. No problems, were there? No, sir. House was almost destroyed, but I got him out all right before the muggles started swarming around. He fell asleep as we was flying over Bristol. Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside, just visible, was a baby boy, fast asleep. Under a tuft of jet black hair over his forehead, they could see a curiously shaped cut, like a bolt of lightning. Is that where? Whispered Professor McGonagall. Yes, said Dumbledore. He'll have that scar forever. Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore? Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars can come in handy. I have one myself above my left knee that is a perfect map of the London Underground. Well, give him here, Hagrid. We'd better get this over with. Dumbledore took Harry in his arms and turned toward the Dursleys' house. Could I say goodbye to him, sir? Asked Hagrid. He bent his great shaggy head over Harry and gave him what must have been a stretchy, whispery kiss. Then, suddenly, Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog. Shh, hissed Professor McGonagall. You wake the Muggles. Sorry, sobbed Hagrid, taking out a large spotted handkerchief and burying his face in it. But I can't stand it. Lily and James dead, and poor little Harry off to live with Muggles. Yes, it's all very sad, but get a grip on yourself, Hagrid, or we'll be found, Professor McGonagall whispered, patting Hagrid gingerly on the arm as Dumbledore stepped over the low garden wall and walked to the front door. He laid Harry gently on the doorstep, took a letter out of his cloak, tucked it inside Harry's blankets, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute, the three of them stood and looked at the little bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor McGonagall blinked furiously, and the twinkling light that usually shone from Dumbledore's eyes seemed to have gone out. Well, said Dumbledore finally, that's that. We've no business staying here. We may as well go and join the celebrations. Yeah, said Hagrid in a very muffled voice, while they taking Sirius's right back. Good night, Professor McGonagall. Professor Dumbledore, sir. Wiping his streaming eyes on his jacket sleeve, Hagrid swung himself onto the motorcycle and kicked the engine into life. With a roar, it rose into the air and off into the night. I shall see you soon, I expect, Professor McGonagall, said Dumbledore, nodding to her. Professor McGonagall blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked back down the street. On the corner, he stopped and took out the silver put-outer. He clicked it once, and 12 balls of light sped back to their street lamps, so that Privet Drive glowed suddenly orange, and he could make out a tabby cat slinking around the corner at the other end of the street. He could just see the bundle of blankets on the step of number 4. Good luck, Harry, he murmured. He turned on his heel, and with a swish of his cloak, he was gone. A breeze ruffled the neat edges of Privet Drive, which lay silent and tidy under the inky sky. The very last place you would expect astonishing things to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside his blankets without waking up. One small hand closed on the letter beside him, And he slept on, not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he would be woken in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put out the milk bottles, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He couldn't know that at this very moment, people meeting in secret all over the country were holding up their glasses and saying in hushed voices, "To Harry Potter, the boy who..." lived. Chapter 2: The Vanishing Glass. Nearly 10 years had passed since the Dursleys had woken up to find their nephew on the front step, but Privet Drive had hardly changed at all. The sun rose on the same tidy front gardens and lit up the brass number 4 on the Dursleys' front door. It crept into their living room, which was almost exactly the same as it had been on the night when Mr. Dursley had seen that fateful news report about the owls. Only the photographs on the mantelpiece really showed how much time had passed. 10 years ago, there had been lots of pictures of what looked like a large pink beach ball wearing different colored bonnets. But Dudley Dursley was no longer a baby, and now the photographs showed a large blond boy riding his first bicycle on the carousel at the fair, playing a computer game with his father, being hugged and kissed by his mother. The room held no sign at all that another boy lived in the house too. Yet Harry Potter was still there, asleep at the moment, but not for long. His Aunt Petunia was awake, and it was her shrill voice that made the first noise of the day. "Up! Get up! Now!" Harry woke with a start. His aunt rapped on the door again. "Up!" she screeched. Harry heard her walking toward the kitchen, and then the sound of the frying pan being put on the stove. He rolled onto his back and tried to remember the dream he had been having. It had been a good one. There had been a flying motorcycle in it. He had a funny feeling he'd had the same dream before. His aunt was back outside the door. "Are you up yet?" she demanded. "Nearly," said Harry. "Well, get a move on. I want you to look after the bacon, and don't you dare let it burn. I want everything perfect on Dudley's birthday." Harry groaned. "What did you say?" His aunt snapped through the door. Nothing. Dudley's birthday. How could he have forgotten? Harry got slowly out of bed and started looking for socks. He found a pair under his bed, and after pulling a spider off one of them, put them on. Harry was used to spiders, because the cupboard under the stairs was full of them, and that was where he slept. When he was dressed, he went down the hall into the kitchen. The table was almost hidden beneath all Dudley's birthday presents. It looked as though Dudley had gotten the new computer he wanted, not to mention the second television and the racing bike. Exactly why Dudley wanted a racing bike was a mystery to Harry, as Dudley was very fat and hated exercise, unless, of course, it involved punching somebody. Dudley's favorite punching bag was Harry, but he couldn't often catch him. Harry didn't like it, but he was very fast. Perhaps it had something to do with living in a dark cupboard, but Harry had always been small and skinny for his age. He looked even smaller and skinnier than he really was, because all he had to wear were old clothes of Dudley's, and Dudley was about 4 times bigger than he was. Harry had a thin face, knobbly knees, black hair, and bright green eyes. He wore round glasses, held together with a lot of Scotch tape, because of all the times Dudley had punched him on the nose. The only thing Harry liked about his own appearance was a very thin scar on his forehead that was shaped like a bolt of lightning. He had had it as long as he could remember, and the first question he could ever remember asking his Aunt Petunia was how he had gotten it. "In the car crash when your parents died," she had said, "and don't ask questions." Don't ask questions. That was the first rule for a quiet life with the Dursleys. Uncle Vernon entered the kitchen as Harry was turning over the bacon. "Comb your hair," he barked by way of a morning greeting. About once a week, Uncle Vernon looked over the top of his newspaper and shouted that Harry needed a haircut. Harry must have had more haircuts than the rest of the boys in his class put together, but it made no difference. His hair simply grew that way, all over the place. Harry was frying eggs by the time Dudley arrived in the kitchen with his mother. Dudley looked a lot like Uncle Vernon. He had a large, thick face, not much neck, small, watery blue eyes, and thick blonde hair that lay smoothly on his thick, fat head. Aunt Petunia often said that Dudley looked like a baby angel. Harry often said that Dudley looked like a pig in a wig. Harry put the plates of egg and bacon on the table, which was difficult as there wasn't much room. Dudley, meanwhile, was counting his presents. His face fell. 36, he said, looking up at his mother and father. "That's 2 less than last year." "Darling, you haven't counted Auntie Marge's present. See, it's here, under this big one from Mommy and Daddy." "All right, 37 then," said Dudley, going red in the face. Harry, who could see a huge Dudley tantrum coming on, began wolfing down his bacon as fast as possible in case Dudley turned the table over. And Petunia obviously scented danger too, because she said quickly, "And we'll buy you another 2 presents while we're out today. How's that, Pumpkin? 2 more presents. Is that all right?" Dudley thought for a moment. It looked like hard work. Finally, he said slowly, "So I'll have 39 sweetums," said Aunt Petunia. "Oh." Dudley sat down heavily and grabbed the nearest parcel. "All right then." Uncle Vernon chuckled. "Little Tyke wants his money's worth, just like his father. Attaboy, Dudley." He ruffled Dudley's hair. At that moment, the telephone rang, and Aunt Petunia went to answer it, while Harry and Uncle Vernon watched Dudley unmap the racing bike, a video camera, a remote-controlled airplane, 16 new computer games, and a VCR. He was ripping the paper off a gold wristwatch when Aunt Petunia came back from the telephone, looking both angry and worried. "Bad news, Vernon," she said. "Mrs. Fig's broken her leg. She can't take him." She jerked her head in Harry's direction. Dudley's mouth fell open in horror, but Harry's heart gave a leap. Every year on Dudley's birthday, his parents took him and a friend out for the day, to adventure parks, hamburger restaurants, or the movies. Every year, Harry was left behind with Mrs. Fig, a mad old lady who lived 2 streets away. Harry hated it there. The whole house smelled of cabbage, and Mrs. Fig made him look at photographs of all the cats she'd ever owned. "Now what?" said Aunt Petunia, looking furiously at Harry as though he'd planned this. Harry knew he ought to feel sorry that Mrs. Fig had broken her leg, but it wasn't easy when he reminded himself it would be a whole year before he had to look at Tibbles, Snowy, Mr. Paws, and Tufty again. "We could phone Marge," Uncle Vernon suggested. "Don't be silly, Vernon. She hates the boy." The Dursleys often spoke about Harry like this, as though he wasn't there, or rather, as though he was something very nasty that couldn't understand them, like a slug. "What about what's-her-name, your friend, Yvonne?" "On vacation in Majorca," snapped Aunt Petunia. "You could just leave me here," Harry put in hopefully. He'd be able to watch what he wanted on television for a change, and maybe even have a go on Dudley's computer. Aunt Petunia looked as though she'd just swallowed a lemon. "And come back and find the house in ruins?" she snarled. "I won't blow up the house," said Harry, but they weren't listening. "I suppose we could take him to the zoo," said Aunt Petunia slowly, "and leave him in the car." "That car's new. He's not sitting in it alone." Dudley began to cry loudly. In fact, he wasn't really crying. It had been years since he'd really cried. but he knew that if he screwed up his face and wailed, his mother would give him anything he wanted. "Dinky Duddy Duns, don't cry. Mummy won't let him spoil your special day," she cried, flinging her arms around him. "I don't want him to come," Dudley yelled between huge pretend sobs. "He always spoils everything." He shot Harry a nasty grin through the gap in his mother's arms. Just then, the doorbell rang. "Oh, good Lord, they're here," said Aunt Petunia frantically, and a moment later, Dudley's best friend, Piers Polkiss, walked in with his mother. Piers was a scrawny boy with a face like a rat. He was usually the one who held people's arms behind their backs while Dudley hit them. Dudley stopped pretending to cry at once. Half an hour later, Harry, who couldn't believe his luck, was sitting in the back of the Dursleys' car with Piers and Dudley, on the way to the Zoo for the first time in his life. His aunt and uncle hadn't been able to think of anything else to do with it, but before they left, Uncle Vernon had taken Harry aside. "I'm warning you," he had said, putting his large purple face right up close to Harry's. "I'm warning you now, boy. Any funny business, anything at all, and you'll be in that cupboard from now until Christmas." "I'm not going to do anything," said Harry. "Honestly," but Uncle Vernon didn't believe him. No one ever did. The problem was, strange things often happened around Harry, and it was just no good telling the Dursleys he didn't make them happen. Once, Aunt Petunia, tired of Harry coming back from the barber's looking as though he hadn't been at all, had taken a pair of kitchen scissors and cut his hair so short he was almost bald except for his bangs, which she left to hide that horrible scar. Dudley had laughed himself silly at Harry, who spent a sleepless night imagining school the next day, where he was already laughed at for his baggy clothes and taped glasses. Next morning, however, he had gotten up to find his hair exactly as it had been before Aunt Petunia had sheared it off. He had been given a week in his cupboard for this, even though he had tried to explain that he couldn't explain how it had grown back so quickly. Another time, Aunt Petunia had been trying to force him into a revolting old sweater of Dudley's, brown with orange puffballs. The harder she tried to pull it over his head, the smaller it seemed to become, until finally it might have fitted a hand puppet, but certainly wouldn't fit Harry. Aunt Petunia had decided it must have shrunk in the wash, and, to his great relief, Harry wasn't punished. On the other hand, he'd gotten into terrible trouble for being found on the roof of the school kitchens. Dudley's gang had been chasing him as usual when, as much to Harry's surprise as anyone else's, there he was, sitting on the chimney. The Dursleys had received a very angry letter from Harry's headmistress, telling them Harry had been climbing school buildings. But all he'd tried to do, as he shouted at Uncle Vernon through the locked door of his cupboard, was jump behind the big trash cans outside the kitchen doors. Harry supposed that the wind must have caught him in mid-jump. But today, nothing was going to go wrong. It was even worth being with Dudley and Piers to be spending the day somewhere that wasn't school, his cupboard, or Mrs. Figg's cabbage-smelling living room. While he drove, Uncle Vernon complained to Aunt Petunia. He liked to complain about things. People had
One second, everyone.
The council, Harry, the bank, and Harry were just a few of his favorite subjects. This morning, it was motorcycles. "Roaring along like maniacs, the young hoodlums," he said, as a motorcycle overtook them. "I had a dream about a motorcycle," said Harry, remembering suddenly. "It was flying." Uncle Vernon nearly crashed into the car in front. He turned right around in his seat and yelled at Harry, his face like a gigantic beak with a mustache. "Motorcycles don't fly." Dudley and Piers sniggered. "I know they don't," said Harry. "It was only a dream." But he wished he hadn't said anything. If there was one thing the Dursleys hated even more than his asking questions, it was his talking about anything acting in a way it shouldn't, no matter if it was in a dream or even a cartoon. They seemed to think he might get dangerous ideas. It was a very sunny Saturday, and the zoo was crowded with families. The Dursleys bought Dudley and Piers large chocolate ice creams at the entrance. And then, because the smiling lady in the van had asked Harry what he wanted before they could hurry him away, they bought him a cheap lemon ice pop. It wasn't bad either, Harry thought, licking it as they watched a gorilla scratching its head, who looked remarkably like Dudley, except that it wasn't blonde. Harry had the best morning he'd had in a long time. He was careful to walk a little way apart from the Dursleys so that Dudley and Piers, who were starting to get bored with the animals by lunchtime, wouldn't fall back on their favorite hobby of hitting him. They ate in the zoo restaurant, and when Dudley had a tantrum because his Knickerbocker Glory didn't have enough ice cream on top, Uncle Vernon bought him another one, and Harry was allowed to finish the first. Harry felt afterward that he should have known it was all too good to last. After lunch, they went to the reptile house. It was cool and dark in there, with lit windows all along the walls. Behind the glass, all sorts of lizards and snakes were crawling and slithering over bits of wood and stone. Dudley and Piers wanted to see huge, poisonous cobras and thick, man-crushing pythons. Dudley quickly found the largest snake in the place. It could have wrapped its body twice around Uncle Vernon's car and crushed it into a trash can. But at the moment, it didn't look in the mood. In fact, it was fast asleep. Dudley stood with his nose pressed against the glass, staring at the glistening brown coils. "Make it move," he whined at his father. Uncle Vernon tapped on the glass, but the snake didn't budge. "Do it again," Dudley ordered. Uncle Vernon rapped on the glass smartly with his knuckles, but the snake just snoozed on. "This is boring," Dudley moaned. He shuffled away. Harry moved in front of the tank and looked intently at the snake. He wouldn't have been surprised if it had died of boredom itself. No company except stupid people drumming their fingers on the glass trying to disturb it all day long. It was worse than having a cupboard as a bedroom, where the only visitor was Aunt Petunia hammering on the door to wake you up. At least he got to visit the rest of the house. The snake suddenly opened its beady eyes. Slowly, very slowly, it raised its head until its eyes were on a level with Harry's. It winked. Harry stared. Then he looked quickly around to see if anyone was watching. They weren't. He looked back at the snake and winked too. The snake jerked its head toward Uncle Vernon and Dudley, then raised its eyes to the ceiling. It gave Harry a look and said, quite plainly, "I get that all the time." "I know," Harry murmured through the glass, though he wasn't sure the snake could hear it. "It must be really annoying." The snake nodded vigorously. "Where do you come from, anyway?" Harry asked. The snake jabbed its tail at a little sign next to the glass. Harry peered at it. "Boa constrictor, Brazil." "Was it nice there?" The boa constrictor jabbed its tail at the sign again, and Harry read on. "This specimen was bred in the zoo." "Oh, I see. So you've never been to Brazil?" As the snake shook its head, a deafening shout behind Harry made both of them jump. "Dudley, Mr. Dursley, come and look at this snake. You won't believe what it's doing." Dudley came waddling toward them as fast as he could. "Out of the way, you," he said, punching Harry in the ribs. Caught by surprise, Harry fell hard on the concrete floor. What came next happened so fast no one saw how it happened. 1 second, Piers and Dudley were leaning right up close to the glass. The next, they had leapt back with howls of horror. Harry sat up and gasped. The glass front of the boa constrictor's tank had vanished. The great snake was uncoiling itself rapidly, slithering out onto the floor. People throughout the reptile house screamed and started running for the exits. As the snake slid swiftly past him, Harry could have sworn a low, hissing voice said, Brazil, here I come. Thanks, amigo. The keeper of the reptile house was in shock. But the glass, he kept saying. Where did the glass go? The zoo director himself made Aunt Petunia a cup of strong, sweet tea while he apologized over and over again. Piers and Dudley could only gibber. As far as Harry had seen, the snake hadn't done anything except snap playfully at their heels as it passed. But by the time they were all back in Uncle Vernon's car, Dudley was telling them how it had nearly bitten off his leg, while Piers was swearing it had tried to squeeze him to death. But worst of all, for Harry at least, was Piers calming down enough to say, Harry was talking to it. Weren't you, Harry? Uncle Vernon waited until Piers was safely out of the house before starting on Harry. He was so angry he could hardly speak. He managed to say, Go, cupboard, stay, no reels, before he collapsed into a chair, and Aunt Petunia had to run and get him a large brandy. Harry lay in his dark cupboard much later, wishing he had a watch. He didn't know what time it was, and he couldn't be sure the Dursleys were asleep yet. Until they were, he couldn't risk sneaking to the kitchen for some food. He'd lived with the Dursleys almost 10 years. 10 miserable years, as long as he could remember, ever since he'd been a baby and his parents had died in that car crash. He couldn't remember being in the car when his parents had died. Sometimes, when he strained his memory during long hours in his cupboard, he came up with a strange vision, a blinding flash of green light and a burning pain on his forehead. This, he supposed, was the crash, though he couldn't imagine where all the green light came from. He couldn't remember his parents at all. His aunt and uncle never spoke about them, and of course he was forbidden to ask questions. There were no photographs of them in the house. When he had been younger, Harry had dreamed and dreamed of some unknown relation coming to take him away, but it had never happened. The Dursleys were his only family. Yet sometimes he thought, or maybe hoped, that strangers in the street seemed to know him. Very strange strangers they were, too. A tiny man in a violet top hat had bowed to him once while out shopping with Aunt Petunia and Dudley. After asking Harry furiously if he knew the man, Aunt Petunia had rushed them out of the shop without buying anything. A wild-looking old woman dressed all in green had waved merrily at him once on a bus. A bald man in a very long purple coat had actually shaken his hand in the street the other day, and then walked away without a word. The weirdest thing about all these people was the way they seemed to vanish the second Harry tried to get a closer look. At school, Harry had no one. Everybody knew that Dudley's gang hated that odd Harry Potter in his baggy old clothes and broken glasses, and nobody liked to disagree with.
Housing, Lincoln? Not great. Finding out what you can afford. Pretty great. See what's possible with Scylla.
Dudley's gang. Chapter 3. The Letters from No One. The escape of the Brazilian boa constrictor earned Harry his longest ever punishment. By the time he was allowed out of his cupboard again, the summer holidays had started, and Dudley had already broken his new video camera, crashed his remote-controlled airplane, and, first time out on his racing bike, knocked down old Mrs. Big as she crossed Privet Drive on her crutches. Harry was glad school was over, but there was no escaping Dudley's gang, who visited the house every single day. Piers, Dennis, Malcolm, and Gordon were all big and stupid, but as Dudley was the biggest and stupidest of the lot, he was the leader. The rest of them were all quite happy to join in Dudley's favorite sport, Harry hunting. This was why Harry spent as much time as possible out of the house, wandering around and thinking about the end of the holidays, where he could see a tiny ray of hope. When September came, he would be going off to secondary school, and for the first time in his life, he wouldn't be with Dudley. Dudley had been accepted at Uncle Vernon's old private school, Smeltings. Piers Polkiss was going there too. Harry, on the other hand, was going to Stonewall High, the local public school. Dudley thought this was very funny. They stuff people's heads down the toilet the first day at Stonewall, he told Harry. Want to come upstairs and practice? No thanks, said Harry. The poor toilets never have anything as horrible as your head down it. It might be sick. Then he rang, before Dudley could work out what he'd said. One day in July, Aunt Petunia took Dudley to London to buy his Smeltings uniform, leaving Harry at Mrs. Figg's. Mrs. Figg wasn't as bad as usual. It turned out she'd broken her leg tripping over one of her cats, and she didn't seem quite as fond of them as before. She let Harry watch television and gave him a bit of chocolate cake that tasted as though she'd had it for several years. That evening, Dudley paraded around the living room for the family in his brand new uniform. Smeltings boys wore maroon tailcoats, orange knickerbockers, and flat straw hats called doders. They also carried knobbly sticks, used for hitting each other while the teachers were looking. This was supposed to be good training for later life. As he looked at Dudley in his new knickerbockers, Uncle Vernon said gruffly that it was the proudest moment of his life. Aunt Petunia burst into tears and said she couldn't believe it was her Ickle Dudleykins. He looked so handsome and grown up. Harry didn't trust himself to speak. He thought 2 of his ribs might already have cracked from trying not to laugh. There was a horrible smell in the kitchen the next morning when Harry went in for breakfast. It seemed to be coming from a large metal tub in the sink. He went to have a look. The tub was full of what looked like dirty rags swimming in gray water. "What's this?" he asked Aunt Petunia. Her lips tightened as they always did if he dared to ask a question. "Your new school uniform," she said. Harry looked in the bowl again. "Oh," he said. "I didn't realize it had to be so wet." "Don't be stupid," snapped Aunt Petunia. "I'm dyeing some of Dudley's old things gray for you. It'll look just like everyone else's when I've finished." Harry seriously doubted this, but thought it best not to argue. He sat down at the table and tried not to think about how he was going to look on his first day at Stonewall High. Like he was wearing bits of old elephant skin, probably. Dudley and Uncle Vernon came in, both with wrinkled noses because of the smell from Harry's new uniform. Uncle Vernon opened his newspaper as usual, and Dudley banged his smelting stick, which he carried everywhere, on the table. They heard the click of the mail slot and flop of letters on the doormat. "Get the mail, Dudley," said Uncle Vernon from behind his paper. "Make Harry get it." "Get the mail, Harry." "Make Dudley get it." "Poke him with your smelting stick, Dudley." Harry dodged the smelting stick and went to get the mail. 3 things lay on the doormat. A postcard from Uncle Vernon's sister Marge, who was vacationing on the Isle of Wight, a brown envelope that looked like a bill, and a letter for Harry. Harry picked it up and stared at it, his heart twanging like a giant elastic band. No one ever in his whole life had written to him. Who would? He had no friends, no other relatives. He didn't belong to the library, so he'd never even got rude notes asking for books back. Yet here it was, a letter, addressed so plainly there could be no mistake. Mr. H. Potter, The Cupboard Under the Stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. The envelope was thick and heavy, made of yellowish parchment, and the address was written in emerald green ink. There was no stamp. Turning the envelope over, his hand trembling, Harry saw a purple wax seal bearing a coat of arms, a lion, an eagle, a badger, and a snake surrounding a large letter H. "Hurry up, boy," shouted Uncle Vernon from the kitchen. "What are you doing, checking for letter bombs?" He chuckled at his own joke. Harry went back to the kitchen, still staring at his letter. He handed Uncle Vernon the bill and the postcard, sat down, and slowly began to open the yellow envelope. Uncle Vernon ripped open the bill, snorted in disgust, and flipped over the postcard. "Marge is ill," he informed Aunt Petunia. Made a funny growl. "Dad," said Dudley suddenly. "Dad, Harry's got something." Harry was on the point of unfolding his letter, which was written on the same heavy parchment as the envelope, when it was jerked sharply out of his hand by Uncle Vernon. "That's mine," said Harry, trying to snatch it back. "Who'd be writing to you?" sneered Uncle Vernon, shaking the letter open with one hand and glancing at it. His face went from red to green faster than a set of traffic lights, and it didn't stop there. Within seconds, it was the grayish white of Old Porridge. "Petunia," he gasped. Dudley tried to grab the letter to read it, but Uncle Vernon held it high out of his reach. Aunt Petunia took it curiously and read the first line. For a moment it looked as though she might faint. She clutched her throat and made a choking noise. "Vernon! Oh my goodness! Vernon!" They stared at each other, seeming to have forgotten that Harry and Dudley were still in the room. Dudley wasn't used to being ignored. He gave his father a sharp tap on the head with his smelting stick. "I want to read that letter," he said loudly. "I want to read it," said Harry furiously, "as it's mine." "Get out, both of you," croaked Uncle Vernon, stuffing the letter back inside its envelope. Harry didn't move. "I want my letter," he shouted. "Let me see it," demanded Dudley. "Out!" roared Uncle Vernon, and he took both Harry and Dudley by the scruffs of their necks and threw them into the hall, slamming the kitchen door behind them. Harry and Dudley promptly had a furious but silent fight over who would listen at the keyhole. Dudley won, so Harry, his glasses dangling from one ear, lay flat on his stomach to listen at the crack between door and floor. "Vernon," Aunt Petunia was saying in a quivering voice, "look at the address. How could they possibly know where he sleeps? You don't think they're watching the house?" "Watching, spying, might be following us," muttered Uncle Vernon wildly. "But what should we do, Vernon? Should we write back? Tell them we don't want?" Harry could see Uncle Vernon's shiny black shoes pacing up and down the kitchen. "No," he said finally. "No, we'll ignore it. If they don't get an answer, yes, that's best. We won't do anything. But I'm not having one in the house, Petunia. Didn't we swear when we took him in we'd stamp out that dangerous nonsense?" That evening, when he got back from work, Uncle Vernon did something he'd never done before. He visited Harry in his cupboard. "Where's my letter?" said Harry the moment Uncle Vernon had squeezed through the door. "Who's writing to me?" "No one. It was addressed to you by mistake," said Uncle Vernon shortly. "I have burned it." "It was not a mistake," said Harry angrily. "It had my cupboard on it." "Silence!" yelled Uncle Vernon, and a couple of spiders fell from the ceiling. He took a few deep breaths and then forced his face into a smile, which looked quite painful. Yes, Harry, about this cupboard. Your aunt and I have been thinking you're really getting a bit big for it. We think it might be nice if you moved into Dudley's second bedroom." "Why?" said Harry. "Don't ask questions," snapped his uncle. "Take this stuff upstairs now." The Dursleys' house had 4 bedrooms, one for Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia, one for visitors, usually Uncle Vernon's sister Marge, one where Dudley slept, and one where Dudley kept all the toys and things that wouldn't fit into his first bedroom. It only took Harry one trip upstairs to move everything he owned from the cupboard to this room.
Hey, Cassie,
He
how
sat
you
down on the
doing?
bed and stared around him.
Hope you're doing good.
Everything in here was broken.
Actually, let me show you the one I'm working on.
Top of a small working tank Dudley had once driven over the next door neighbor's dog. In the corner was
So you can
Dudley's
see it a
first
little
ever
bit better.
television set, which he put his foot through when his favorite program had been canceled.
Not a very big light
It was a
table.
large
It barely
bird
holds
which had
the
once held a parrot that Dudley had swapped
the
at school
ones I
for a
do.
real air rifle, which was up on the shelf
But
with the end all bent
I can
because Dudley
take all
had
this
sat on it.
off.
Other shelves were full of books. They were the only things in the room that looked as though they'd never been touched. From downstairs came the sound of Dudley bawling at his mother. "I don't want him in there. I need that room. Make him get out." Harry sighed and stretched out on the bed. Yesterday, he'd have given anything to be up here. Today, he'd
Oh, yeah.
rather be back in his cupboard
Yes.
with that letter than up
See
here
what I can do there.
without it. Next morning at breakfast, everyone was rather quiet. Dudley was in shock. He'd screamed, whacked his father with his smelting stick, been sick on purpose, kicked his mother, and thrown his tortoise through the greenhouse roof, and he still didn't have his room back. He was thinking about this time yesterday, and bitterly wishing he'd opened the letter in the hall.
Okay, let me
Uncle
straighten
Vernon
this
and
out
Aunt
now.
Petunia kept looking at each other darkly. When the mail arrived, Uncle Vernon, who seemed to be trying to be nice to Harry, made Dudley go and get it. They heard him banging things with his smelting stick all the way down the hall. Then he shouted,
Now I gotta straighten it out again, but just
Mr.
give me
H.
1
Potter,
second.
the smallest bedroom, 4 Privet Drive. With a strangled cry, Uncle Vernon leapt from his seat and ran down the hall, Harry right behind him. Uncle Vernon had to wrestle Dudley to the ground to get the letter from him, which was made difficult by the fact that Harry had grabbed Uncle Vernon around the neck.
I got it from my ad.
Fighting, in which everyone got hit a lot.
At least the diamond painting I did.
Straightened up, gasping for breath, with Harry's letter clutched in his hand. Go to your cupboard. I mean, your bedroom. He wheezed at Harry. Dudley, go. Just go. Harry walked round and round his new room. Someone knew
I just gotta
he
put
moved out of his cupboard.
these back
But it
on.
seemed to know he hadn't received his first letter. Surely that meant they'd try again, and this time he'd make sure they didn't fail. He had a plan. The repaired alarm clock rang at 6 o'clock the next morning. Harry turned it off quickly and dressed silently. He mustn't wake the Dursleys. He stole downstairs without turning on any of the lights. He was going to wait for the postman on the corner of Privet Drive and get the letters for number 4 first. His heart hammered as he crept across the dark hall toward the front door. Harry leapt into the air. He'd trodden on something big and squashy on the doormat. Something alive. Lights clicked on upstairs, and to his horror, Harry realized that the big squashy something had been his uncle's face. Uncle Vernon had been lying at the foot of the front door in a sleeping bag, clearly making sure that Harry didn't do exactly what he'd been trying to do. He shouted at Harry for about half an hour, and then told him to go and make a cup of tea. Harry shuffled miserably off into the kitchen, and by the time he got back, the mail had arrived, right into Uncle Vernon's lap. Harry could see 3 letters addressed in green ink. I want, he began, but Uncle Vernon was tearing the letters into pieces before his eyes. Uncle Vernon didn't go to work that day. He stayed at home and nailed up the mail slot. See, he explained to Aunt Petunia through a mouthful of nails. If they can't deliver them, they'll just give up. I'm not sure that'll work, Vernon. Oh, these people's minds work in strange ways, Petunia. They're not like you and me, said Uncle Vernon, trying to knock in a nail with the piece of fruitcake Aunt Petunia had just brought him. On Friday, no less than 12 letters arrived for Harry.
You know what? Let's do
they had been pushed under the door.
Let's do a dab real quick.
And a few even forced through the small window in the downstairs bathroom. Uncle Vernon stayed at home again. After burning all the letters, he got out a hammer and nails and boarded up the cracks around the front.
Hey, Scratchin', D-Man, how you doing?
He hung tiptoe tulips as
about to do a dab real quick.
At small noises. On Saturday, things began to get out of hand. 24 letters to Harry found their way into the house.
Turn this light on.
Up and hidden inside each of the 24 eggs that their very confused milkman had handed Aunt Petunia through the living room window. While Uncle Vernon made furious telephone calls to the post office and the dairy, trying to find someone to complain to, Aunt Petunia shredded the letters in her food processor. Who on earth wants to talk to you this badly? Dudley asked Harry in amazement. On Sunday morning,
you know what, Cass,
sat down
give you a
looking tired
rinse
and
real
rather
quick.
ill, but happy. No post on Sundays, he reminded them cheerfully as he spread marmalade on his newspapers. No damn letters
There
today.
you go.
Something came whizzing down the kitchen chimney as he spoke and caught him sharply
One
on the back
second.
of the head. Next moment,
Ugh.
30 or 40 letters came pelting out of the fireplace like bullets. The Dursleys ducked, but Harry leapt into the air trying to catch one. Out! Out! Uncle Vernon seized Harry around the waist and threw him into the hall.
Lunch.
When Petunia and Dudley had run out with their arms over their faces, Uncle Vernon slammed the door shut. They could hear the letters still streaming into the room, bouncing off the walls and floor. That does it.
No
said
problem,
Uncle Vernon,
Cassie.
trying to speak calmly, but pulling great tufts out of his mustache at the same time.
Lunch.
I want
No.
you all back
Oh, yes,
here
you off?
in 5 minutes,
Oh,
ready
shit.
to leave. You're going
It was
away.
pretty much only me
Just
then.
hats and
Oh
clothes.
shit.
The other guy couldn't get a ride.
Oh shit.
That's so dangerous.
Because at first he said supposed to do, because we were having to do base sports.
Uh-huh.
Well, that didn't happen because the other guy wasn't there. So no stall. Then he sent me a message saying to, after we got done with that building C, we go around the complex, property, and pretty much pick up all those appliances, like fridges, stoves, washers, and take them to the base. Well, when I found out he wasn't showing up, I was like, well, I'm going to get started on this. I moved everything in the front of my Tahoe, in the back to the front, and that's what I used
Oh shit.
for the fridge and everything.
Mhm.
I fucking laid them down and slid them in the back of the Tahoe.
Oh shit.
Like the dryers,
Mhm.
when it came like to the dryers, washers, and all that, I could do 2 at a time.
Uh-huh.
I think we'll put it long ways, slide them in and put 2 in there.
Oh damn.
Uncle Vernon stopped at last outside a
But yeah,
hotel on the outskirts of a big city. Dudley and Harry shared a room with twin beds and damp, musty sheets. Dudley snored,
Oh damn.
but Harry
You see the
stayed awake,
fridges?
Uh-huh.
sitting on the window
And right here,
staring
there's
down at the
still
lights of passing cars
2
and
behind it,
So that chairs and shit.
couches.
Oh
They
shit.
ate stale
Yeah.
cornflakes and
Those
cold
2 of
tinned
those,
tomatoes on toast
but
for
those,
breakfast
that one, there's one behind it, there's that stove,
Yeah.
dishwasher behind that,
Excuse me.
there was that, and there's another one right in front of it.
There's
2 more right there.
Mhm.
Those
She
2,
held up a letter so he could
that,
read the green ink
and you barely sleep
Mr.
a
H.
TV.
Potter,
Oh damn.
17,
And what's crazy, out of all that shit,
Filthworth.
the TV and the hot water heater was the heaviest.
No, damn.
The hot water heater is only, that's tough.
Oh shit.
I'll take them. Said Uncle
Yeah,
Vernon,
those were the
standing up
heaviest.
quickly and
Damn.
following her from the dining room.
Yeah, that's what I did all day.
Mm-mm.
Wouldn't it be better just to go home, dear?
Then when I got there, this one guy drives by and asked if I spoke Spanish.
But Uncle Vernon didn't
I was
seem
like,
to be
no.
exactly
So he fucking
what he was looking
Use that
for.
Google Translator.
Uh-huh.
Here's one to see, because he had a TV mounted on his wall,
Uh-huh.
because he was moving.
Uh,
And he wanted to see if I could go through and cop the hose and paint it off the record. So the office didn't know. So he didn't get charged. And I'll give you $20. I'm like, okay, we know this fucking got to play, fucking fillable holder, fucking real quick with the paint on that. Done. Took me 3 minutes.
Yeah. Should have told him, like, okay, give me half of what your security deposit would be.
Dudley sniffled. It's Monday, he told his mother. The great Humberto's
Have you tried
on
that one?
tonight.
Nuh-uh.
I
wonder how that would be with that crown.
Uh-huh. Guess we'll find out, huh?
This reminded Harry of something. If it was
But yeah,
Monday,
unfortunately,
then he could use her
this
account
week-
on Dudley to know the days
this
of the
week's
week
pay is
because
being
of
held.
television.
What?
Tomorrow,
How most
Tuesday,
places do, because
was
how he
Harry's
still has
11th
to
birthday.
document
Of
everything.
course,
Mhm.
his birthdays were never
So
exactly
if he
perfect.
held up,
Last year, the
It'd
Dursleys
be next
had
week.
given a coat hanger and a pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks.
Uh,
Still, you work 11 every
then
day.
what? That sounds like more like putting you on a payroll.
well, no, because he don't have none of my info.
And didn't answer Aunt Petunia when she asked.
It's
what
just the way
thought.
he has to do everything,
Found
even
the
though he
perfect place.
pays
He
cash.
Come on,
He still has to
everyone
do
out.
it that way to keep
It was
everything
very cold outside the car.
on his end.
Uncle Vernon was pointing at what looked like a large
No, Aiden,
rock
huh?
way out
Oh,
at
he'd
sea.
still be doing it.
Perched on
You just
top
have
of
to
the
wait
rock
for pay till
was the
next
most
week.
miserable
Tell me,
shack
pay being
you
held?
could imagine.
Yeah.
One thing was certain.
My pay's getting held, so is yours.
Storm forecast for tonight, said Uncle Vernon gleefully, clapping his hands together. And this gentleman's kindly agreed to lend us his boat. But toothless old man came ambling up to them, pointing with a rather wicked grin at an old rowboat bobbing in the iron-gray water below them. I've already got us some rations, said Uncle Vernon, so all aboard. It was freezing in the boat. Icy sea spray and rain crept down their necks, and a chilly wind licked their faces. After what seemed like hours, they reached the rock, where Uncle Vernon, slipping and sliding, led the way to the broken-down house. The inside was horrible. It smelled strongly of seaweed. The wind whistled through the gaps in the wooden walls.
Yeah, that welder, the name keeps talking about being a TIG welder. It's two welders.
Oh shit.
They're both the stick welders.
So it's not what you gonna call it?
Yeah, it's not a TIG.
Uh-uh.
Gotta look at them because I have to get into that unit today and get a washer and stove out of there.
Oh damn.
But you see that little handle for the sticks on both of them.
Oh shit. I guess Antonio's gonna be picking me up about 4 or 5 to go over there and do that.
What, today?
Yeah. Why that late in the evening? Huh.
Right.
How's everyone doing this afternoon?
Oh, you're streaming?
Yeah.
I didn't get the notification.
No?
No.
I even shared it out on a couple of things too.
Recently confessed to a double murder case and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms.
That person was a barbecue customer for 6-7 years, someone you can trust.
So I asked her if she needed to take anything. She said, no, she got a shovel and a rake.
But he says he's
She's gonna have to go old school cutting that, huh?
But at the 3.5 years he has spent in jail trying to prove his innocence has served the purpose.
This rock is the word of God, and we got to start building our life on the word of God, not what the man says and what people say, what our friends say. We got to build our life on what God says, you know. God's word.
Yeah, because that's why he went ahead and paid me last week for
I have enough faith
Wednesday and
right now.
Thursday.
Uh-huh.
And he put in the books that I started on that Friday.
Thanks.
So-
Leads Bible studies for the men in his
Yeah.
house and is regarded as a jailhouse pastor. But in another unit, Michael Lesher pledges allegiance to a different entity.
You got Lucifer and Satan. From death I found life, and hell is my paradise. This is my paradise.
Lesher says his belief in Satanism is illustrated by his numerous tattoos. All of
Yeah, that
which
fucking
were
TV
accumulated
is what
during
about
his
did
various
me
prison
in.
stays.
Oh shit.
It's better than some of
I'm just in the bushes doing the
things,
drug.
but, it's really not all that extravagant. It's definitely not.
Diamond art. Yeah.
It was all single needle.
And the TV is like that white.
Oh damn.
And about that talk.
Itself, that's just me being
One of the old school heavy ones, huh?
Yeah. Like that little picture we see, like back in our days, like no one stole TVs.
Right?
Believe in being anti-Christian.
That was raw. But yeah, that and the hot water heater is why I strained the most on.
Oh damn.
Everything else was pretty easy,
My original belief,
especially the dryers.
Satanism as an
Oh shit.
Cause they were like I could just lean them,
Uh-huh.
grab them by the top and pick them up.
Oh shit.
Wash it and shit. Nope.
You can't have one without the other. It's a balance.
Oh.
But in Lesher's case,
So what I'm gonna do when I do get paid,
Uh-huh.
I'm gonna put money on my
Me,
Cash App, and I'm gonna order just a few different size pins. The brass pins. There's one is like a 3 millimeter.
Yeah.
That's one of the most popular sold.
But can't we like what Coolest saying, use the drill bit?
Well, the drill bits ain't the same measurements.
Oh, they're
They're
not.
like 9/16 or some shit like that. They're not in millimeters. I'm just gonna do that. I'm just gonna order a few of the other pins that you have them.
Okay.
Michael Lesher and Thomas Nichols both received important news regarding their cases.
I had a dream about God releasing me.
Welcome to Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria, where fantasy and fun come to life. When inspiration strikes, snap it. Now you can upload it from and with this, Amazon Lens will have a list of similar styles to shop from. Your new look is right at your fingertips. Snap it, shop it. Amazon Lens.
In filmmaking, we can find moments of connection.
But it's hard. You need to fight for the work you want to do. It's really about that experience.
It's so important to have a team that supports my vision.
ITV Pro has been a really great resource to find my great collaborators.
You can't make films alone. IMDb Pro is the place where you can find the people to make something beautiful with.
Business can mean a lot of things. For some, it's earning reports, the top MBA program, investments. Business isn't everything we do. The side hustle that exploded to the next $1 billion company. I need to create my own product that I control what marketing. Unconventional ideas that change the world. AI is everything. Venture capital pouring in whatever business means to you. Wondery podcasts are the destination for business inspiration. You're listening
Ad-free
On Wondery Plus.
Join Wondery Plus now.
Just so now.
How's the little? Have you heard how the little one's doing?
This morning I heard she was doing it still the same, but when they were still laying down.
Officials
I'm about
asked
to find out.
any known enemies they might already have here.
She was saying she was laying her mist with it.
In separate houses.
But she's still holding it up.
Yeah.
But inmates rarely disclose every conflict they've had on the streets, such as the dispute over $5 in a six-pack of beer. That led to a
That's a
recent
long
fight
wait to
between
be landing on her like that.
and two other inmates.
Oh, she's already down there or
Yeah,
what?
she was right at the door, and he jumped off the bed and landed right on her.
Ooh, and then from the height too.
Yeah.
On the back of his head in a fight with Guadalupe Lopez and Luis Hernandez, both of whom admitted to the fight but denied the injuries.
I'm gonna sleep good tonight. I'm fucking early.
Oh, something for the pain.
After Sergeant Tucker investigated a rumor that Sanchez had fought with two other inmates days earlier, Sanchez admitted
Got me
to
roaches
the
for the week.
as did the cut in the back of his head, which was reopened in the fight with Lopez and Hernandez.
But that's
But he
okay.
still insists they were the ones who burned him with hot
At least
water.
I know it'll be a full pay, huh?
Right.
You want to file charges?
Should I?
It's up to you.
No, to be put on the payroll, he'll have to get my social security number and all that shit. That's what the fuck you right there.
Okay. Allow 4 of them.
He's having to fucking get all that.
The two from
All
2
right.
days ago, we really can't do anything about right now. The only thing we can work on right now is this case here. Yeah, I'll make sure. Okay. That's all I need to know.
That's what they do. They assaulted me. I got assaulted, so they got a civil legal bill who come to me now.
As a member of the white supremacist Aryan Brotherhood gang, Todd Allen has seen his share of violence behind bars as well.
We soldiers, you know what I'm saying? That's what we was brought here for. That's what we was trained for. Whatever we got to do, whatever we need to pull, grab a phone, grab whatever you can grab, you know, start hitting somebody else in the head with.
But Alan's current conflict is not about race. It's
We
about
got plenty of roaches the last week, huh?
Right, and then some.
13-year-old little girl, and he's 38, 39 years old. And you don't do that, man.
I was telling Neighbor about the guy that
children, they tend to become
had me
Some
put
try to
the
make
phones and all that.
Mhm.
Once they find out,
He started laughing.
they lie.
He's like, yeah, he's like, that's another thing. He's like, you'll get that a lot here and there.
Laws can only protect the person.
Oh, yeah. I did find out my Tahoe does have an alarm on it.
What does it?
Yeah, I had to
You know what you do.
break into the window yesterday
Believe it or not,
No, did you?
because I was parked there waiting for him.
Mhm.
Then I fucking,
those types of spots, and they will.
I got out of the Tahoe and I locked it and I went inside to go to use the bathroom.
Mhm.
Came back outside and I went to go grab my keys. I'm like, oh no, and I grabbed the handle that was locked. But my back window was down like that much.
Oh shit.
I grabbed it, I hold it down a little bit more, reached in and opened the door, and all of a sudden that horn started going off. I was like, it does have an alarm.
That's funny.
You know, you don't hold one down, force yourself on nobody, man. A kid is a kid. That's a gift from God.
Thomas Thames has been making.
Grandpa was streaming Fallout earlier.
I saw that.
Known around San Antonio for his partner, Thames has been charged with murder and concealment of corpse in what has been called a drug deal gone bad.
These are my sermons. This is what I wrote a long time ago. Love God. Be careful what you wish for. I'm going home. Be careful what you pray for. I'm going home. Totally free. And I wrote that when I first got here because I knew I was innocent. There's scriptures I pass out every day to inmates. So we have a total of 80 inmates that gets 3 scriptures a day. Like I pass out every day, rain or shine.
We call him Brother T. Thomas. Every day he takes it upon himself and puts a little piece of paper and has 3 Bible verses. You know, this is nice that the Spirit moves him to do that. You know, to take it upon himself to, you know, try to win another soul.
Thames' popularity in his household is not unlike what he enjoyed on the outside as the owner of a barbecue restaurant and catering service, a business that started out in a roadside tent.
I had opportunity to get partnership with a gentleman, and we started doing business together. And so God blessed me with this young man, and he bought a trailer. So not only one trailer, we had 2 trailers. We had 2 locations. And that prospered also. From those 2 locations, we started our restaurant.
One of Thames' customers is now one of his jail keepers. Officer Moore hired Thames to cater parties at his home and took note of his business's growth.
You know, I just kept asking, hey man, you know, how'd you get this money? How'd you do this? How'd you do that? This got a rich benefactor who believes in you. Okay, cool. Do your thing.
Moore was startled to see Thames in jail as an inmate.
That right there was basically made my heart drop. And I was kind of upset, like, what are you doing, man? Hey, Moore, this is what happened. And I told him, I said, straight up, I said, man, don't lie to me, man. What you doing here? That's what I told him.
Thames told Moore he was innocent.
When you know the truth will set you free. And when you know the truth, you'll have to answer many questions, or ask God many questions.
Coming up.
This is the year of release, and this is when God is going to start releasing his chosen ones. And I'm one of those that he's going to be releasing.
Thomas Thames finds out if he will in fact be set free. And Michael Lesher shares his jailhouse fitness tips.
Due to mature subject matter, viewer discretion is advised.
Well, first time this, let me get this little rundown of the roller.
Most inmates at San Antonio's Bexar County Jail find working out is one way to beat the monotony of incarceration. And Michael Lesher is no exception. While Lesher's unusual pull-up method is against jail rules, he says his sets are short enough that he can usually do them out of sight of roving officers. But he knows he can't stay fit from exercise alone.
After the workout, try your hardest to make everything that you put in your body, proteins, starches, things that are going to be snackers, body snackers. That's how you grow. If you don't get enough food, you can only use what you put in your body. If you go work out harder than that, you're going to burn off more than what you put in your body, so you're going to get skinnier. Again, 40 pounds, 44 pounds since I've been here. I don't think too much of it's fat. So I got a six-pack. I'm doing all right.
Unlike most athletes, Lesher finds the meal served by the jail to be effective in fueling rigorous workouts to help get that six-pack from turning into a can.
Remember, it's twice the bread. It's just twice the bread.
I understand all my carbohydrates and all the breakdowns of completely not complete proteins. I know if I'm going to eat something before a workout, things like bread, sugars, as long as you make waste it into a glucose, I use it as energy before a workout.
And Lesher has also figured out how to acquire food trays from other inmates. Most of them are willing to trade their jail-issued meals for snacks purchased from the commissary. And Lesher's more than willing to deal.
I get emotional about food. Say, man, I just want candy because I like candy. I like candy, I like cakes, I like cookies. I like all that stuff too, but it doesn't do nothing for me. So when I think logically, I might as well trade all that to the kids that love that stuff. All their trades, and at the end of the day, they're hungry. I'm sitting there working because I got enough food in my body to do it.
Lesher pays for the commissary snacks through another one of his talents.
What are those?
These are chips, poker chips. These are all poker chips. $2.50 chips, 5-cent chips, 10-cent chips. You know what I mean? But I mean, like I said, it's up to me to survive. My family does what they can, but they can't do too much. They're retired. They're living off of a fixed income. I hustle. I mean, poker tends to be a good hustle for somebody that played for 15 years. I feed off of it. I do what I got to do.
Lesher earns commissary through one other method as well.
My art, I normally don't have a lot of it because it's already sold or I did it. For instance, I have a handkerchief that I'm going to be working on. I make my own handkerchiefs. I have a brand new sheet. What I do is braid the edges. I'll braid them real nice, and then I'll put the portrait of a man's kid and his wife on there. I charge $4 for the handkerchief itself. I'll charge $5 for the design of the portrait, and then I'll charge another $5 to do the portrait on a handkerchief. So between $14 and $16 depending.
Managing the dollars and cents of life behind bars was a skill Lesher has honed over his 15 years of incarceration. Todd Allen has also spent most of the past 20 years in and out of jail and prison. Now he's taken it upon himself to uphold another inmate tradition, one with a decidedly more sinister side.
That's something big. We don't allow snitches, and we don't allow child molesters.
When Allen discovered an accused child molester had moved onto his housing unit, he threatened to dish out his own form of justice. By the next time we saw him, he'd apparently made good on it.
He was in his cell. I went in behind him and shut the door. And that way he couldn't run out of the cell. The door was automatically shut and locked. He was acting like he was asleep. I woke him up. So I'm like, hey, Paul, get up. I got some bad news for you. I said, you got 3 seconds to tell me the truth, boy. And finally he looked at me and he said, yes, sir, that's what I'm here for. And I slapped him. Got him about 3 times. Knocked him off the top bunk. If I had a lot of time on my hands, say I had a life sentence in prison as rank colonel or 20 years, I'd kill the guy.
But Allen achieved another goal. He got the inmate to request a transfer out of the housing unit.
Basically, the unit officer called me and said that he had an inmate that was in fear for safety. So I went to the unit to interview the inmate, and at that time, we sent him down to medical to be evaluated by our medical staff, where he alleges that he fell off his bunk.
Without the cooperation of the victim or witnesses, jail officials were unable to issue any punitive sanctions to Allen.
I'm not gonna just sit here and tell you I did do it. I mean, I'll deny it to the fullest, but if they find out any different, hey, I'll pay the consequences. I'll still feel happy in my heart about myself, you know.
While Allen is proud to take credit for assaulting another inmate, jail officials have been sorting out who's responsible for the water burn suffered by Victor Sanchez in his fight with Guadalupe Lomas and Luis Hernandez. Sanchez blames Lomas and Hernandez. Lomas and Hernandez say the burns were from an earlier fight Sanchez had with two other inmates.
You want to do the water right? No. Who threw the water right? I don't know about that. He's already right there. No. Water should dry. There's no water on the floor. Thomas, sir, what you hitting with? My hand. Who had the thing that cut his back, hit the back of his head over? Oh, I don't know about that, sir. Then he goes out and comes over to me and tells me, what is the weapon you used to bust his head open? I said, what weapon, fool? I just hit him with my hands. Maybe he bumped his head up on the board because he already had a cut. Somebody stomped his ass already. I did what I had to do to defend myself, but I didn't use no weapon to cut him or anything like that. I sure told him why. Look, it's like this. I'm not a fool. I didn't get to be 48 to be an idiot.
After a disciplinary hearing of the matter, the truth finally came out. Sanchez admitted all his injuries, including the burns, were caused in the earlier fight. Even the bloody wound on the back of his head was the reopening of a cut, also from the earlier fight. The criminal charges Sanchez was going to file against Lomas and Hernandez have been dropped. Sometimes in jail, the settling of one dispute is simply the calm before the next one. Coming up.
You talk like a duck, you walk like a duck. Don't get mad at me if I think you're a duck.
Victor Sanchez undergoes interrogation.
The only one person has inconsistent stories. That's a liar.
And Guadalupe Lomas suffers the beating of his own.
I was born with wings. When psoriasis swooped in to clip them, it crushed my confidence.
But no longer will psoriasis get a piece of me.
I can love my skin again. What's Gonzalez?
Only Gonzalez targets and blocks IL-17A plus F to calm inflammation.
I can control my plaques and start getting myself back.
Gonzalez helps adults with moderate to severe psoriasis control plaques to deliver clearer skin fast for results that last.
I will give myself back the freedom of shorts. Dare to wear black again, from head to toe. Most people got 100% clear skin.
Saw him after the first dose. Serious side effects include suicidal thoughts and behavior, infections, and lowered ability to fight them. Liver problems and inflammatory bowel disease have occurred. Tell your doctor if these happen, or if you've had a vaccine or plan to.
Start to get yourself back with Gonzalez.
Ask your dermatologist about Gonzalez today.
Hi, we're visible. Wireless company that makes things visible. For us, what you see is what you get. So a one-line plan with unlimited data, just $25 a month, taxes and fees included, means just that. All this with no hidden fees. And yep, it's all on one line. So you don't need to share a plan to save on one. It's all you. Plus, we're powered by Verizon's 5G network. Sometimes the choice is just visible. Switch today at visible.com.
There's nothing better than the Subway Series football. Except we have all new foot-long sides, like the $2 foot-long churro covered in cinnamon sugar delicious, or the $3 foot-long pretzel, salted and baked to perfection. Honey mustard shot. Let's not forget the $5 foot-long chocolate chip cookie. What's your favorite flavor?
Oh, my goodness. No, you're my favorite side.
I'll get back to him later. Every epic foot-long deserves the perfect side kick.
Inside the walls of San Antonio's Bexar County Jail, Thomas Thames has spent the past 3 years trying to fit his 6'9" body onto a considerably shorter bed. The former basketball player and barbecue restaurant owner has also been fighting charges of murder and concealing a corpse in a case described as a drug dealer gone bad.
I had a dream about God releasing me and opening the gates of heaven, opening the gates so I can be out. And that's the picture right there I have. It's on the wall. This is Jubilee. This is the year of release, and this is when God is going to start releasing his chosen ones. And I'm one of those that he's going to be releasing.
And according to Thames, his statement is no longer one of faith, but of fact.
I was called to court unexpectedly. I went to court and paperwork was already ready. I didn't even know that I was getting my cases. I knew it was going to be dismissed, but I didn't know when. So when I went to court, paperwork was ready to be dismissed. And so it didn't even take me, it took me seconds, or it took me 5 minutes to get my case dismissed. But I had to spend 3.5 years for what it only took 5 minutes to do. I should be leaving any day. Today, tomorrow, Wednesday, I'm just waiting on paperwork to be cleared up. As soon as I get out, my job is to preach the word.
And a few days later, Thames did in fact leave the jail. But he did not go home. While he did have the most serious of his charges, murder, dismissed, Thames had given us an inaccurate account of what actually happened in court.
Unlawful carrying and driving and the capital murder cases were dismissed. And in court, they found him guilty, though, of being disposed of the human corpse, where he was sentenced to 10 years TDC.
Why would he thought he's going to go straight to jail alone?
Now, that part would be a misinterpretation in his part. He was actually there in court with his attorney, in front of the judge, in front of the prosecutor, as far as what he pled out to. So whether he didn't understand or he knew and maybe really misrepresenting the truth to you, I don't know. But he's there in front of the judge and in front of everybody, pleading out to TDC sentence.
When we went to follow up with things, he had already been transferred to a Texas state prison to begin serving his sentence. With the time he's already spent in jail taken into account, Thames will be eligible for parole in a little more than a year. One of his former customers hopes that his incarceration will serve as an important lesson.
A lot of people looked up to him in the community. You know, I want him to get back on track and let him know that, you know what, these chances, you know, are given to you for a reason. You know, you can't mess it up. If you mess it up, you know where you're going to go.
And now, one of the jail's gang intelligence officers suspects another inmate is not being truthful about a particular aspect of his life. The inmate is Victor Sanchez. Officer Rodriguez has received the report that he is an operative for the Mexican Mafia.
Your name came up in a report, Victor. You don't know the report I'm talking about? Roughly 20 days ago? For safety? No, somebody else was in Fairview. No name about that? Okay. The report says that this guy's in fear, saying that you and a bunch of other inmates are basically strong-arming him and other inmates in the unit, and that you're ex-Mexican Mafia. Now, the problem with this report is you also have a history of being identified as a gang member in the past. I understand that, but why would this inmate say that about you? The thing is that there's 44 inmates in that unit. He has 44 people to pick. He identifies you. Why would he do that? It doesn't matter to me. The point is that he identified you. Obviously, something's happening in there if you identify him. We want to go ahead and try to weed out the major prison gangs from their population, because these particular gangs are predatory gangs and they prey upon the weaker inmates in the facility. We want to get them out of population so we can go ahead and make the jail as a whole a safer place for both inmates and staff. So you understand what I'm telling you, right? You probably will today. Your history of being identified as a gang member in this recent report. My job is to figure out where I'm going to house you, and that's what we're talking about.
I'm not doing that. Why should I go down from the unit? You do my report.
I am a victim, of course.
I'm not getting in trouble. I'm not getting right up.
But we just talked about reports you were involved in.
She awake now.
Yeah, she says she's still.
You as a member of the Mexican Mafia, you're not doing that. It doesn't matter who it is. Why would you say that about me?
She says she's still about the same, but she's kind of putting it down a little bit, but not too much.
If she could take off again today.
Well, it's a weekend already.
She don't work on Friday?
Oh, yeah, it's Friday. I'm so fucking.
Officer Rodriguez then changes course to ask Sanchez about the fight he was involved in.
It's been a long week.
At least she's doing good. She letting her touch it and all that.
Because I was able to mess with it yesterday too with no problem. When I was checking it, I was fucking straightening and all that. She was doing fine, but.
So when they did the investigation, it was over beer. Well, which one was it?
Beer and the
only one person has inconsistent stories. That's a liar. Find out. I mean, we're both doing men here, right? There's no point in
I'm gonna be using my other cargo pants, the ones I ordered from the Timo. Those would be my work pants too. Just because they're thin. They won't warm up as much.
Yeah.
Today was warm because I was outside all day today.
Yeah.
Still, without
That sucks, old boy didn't show up.
Yeah, he couldn't get a ride.
no choice but to return.
Then after I was good little into moving all this stuff, he sent me a message too saying that once I got done with that, go ahead and call it a day.
Oh shit.
So I called him and told him what I had left. He's like, all right. That sounds good. And when I got done with everything, I looked at the time, it was 12. I'm like, well, like, okay.
Staff will watch Sanchez for any ties to the Mexican mafia. His former nemesis, Guadalupe Lopez, might have just had his own letter with the gang.
Lawrence is currently serving his grand sentence. A couple of days ago, he was involved in assault. Inmates were out on the daylight hour and took it upon themselves to assault inmate Lomas.
The inmates who assaulted Lomas would not appear on camera, but were sent to disciplinary detention and could possibly face criminal charges.
No one knows the reason why they assaulted him. It's allegations as to why they did it, but no one knows for sure why he got assaulted. Mexican mafia. Supposedly, these young guys probably trying to make a name for themselves and took it upon themselves to assault Lomas.
Lomas, despite his injuries, would not give authorities any information about why he was assaulted. So for now, he will be treated for his wounds and transferred to another segregation unit, away from his assailants. Jail brings hard truths for Michael Lusher.
The person rolled up the doorway like a piece of trash.
And
I'm all cold in, but you never see the crap. It's just
Todd Allen receives disturbing news from both the courts and home.
My family, my friends, my home, everything that I know. And it is so true. I can sing that song, everything that you do comes back tenfold. Life in a bad day, when you made it, a bad man. Whatever, nothing was getting but committed, but I'm trying to put the rest of the plan. I'm gonna be the first white rapper. But it never happened. Life in prison.
Alright, everyone. I'm going to call into this life for right now. Probably get on again later on. I want to thank everyone for stopping by. Everyone continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe.
Michael Lusher has been